Hello and welcome everyone to Solving Kids Cancer UK's Neuroblastoma Parent Symposium 2026 and the fourth of our six-part webinar series. Today's session is titled The Mint Study, Addressing Unmet Need in High-Risk Neuroblastoma. My name is Gavin Lindberg. I'm the co-founder of the Evans Victory Against Neuroblastoma Foundation, and I'm here in the state of Maryland in the US. And it's my great pleasure today to be moderating this session with two really terrific speakers. First, Dr. Sally George, pediatric oncologist and clinician scientist at the Institute of Cancer Research, and then parent advocate Helen McCarthy Tennant. Now, before we begin, I'd just like to draw your attention to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. This is where you can submit questions at any point during the session. And there's also an option to submit questions anonymously and also to upvote questions if you'd like to see those answered. And we'll get to questions after all the presentations have been made. So now I'm going to hand things over to Dr. George, who will talk to us about the MINT study, a clinical trial exploring the combination of MIBG therapy and PARP inhibition. Dr. George will explain how the study aims to address gaps in treatment for specific high-risk neuroblastoma subgroups, such as ATRX-driven disease, and offer insight into the transatlantic collaboration driving the trial. Dr. George?
Thanks very much, Gavin. As Gavin has said, I'm going to talk about a clinical trial called MINT, which stands for MIBG therapy in neuroblastoma combined with talazoparib. And so the two treatments that we give as part of this study are MIBG therapy and talazoparib. What I'm going to do over the next 20 minutes or so is talk a little bit about early phase clinical trials in neuroblastoma and where MINT fits in with that. I'm going to talk about how both MIBG therapy and talazoparib work. And then I'll talk a bit about the science behind the MINT study and who might benefit from it, before talking about the design of the MINT study in more detail. So starting with early phase clinical trials and where MINT fits in. So just to put this in the context of the clinical trial landscape for neuroblastoma. So I'm sure that many people on the call will be familiar with the high-risk MBL2 clinical trial. This would be the option that we offer to children in the UK and Europe at the time of first diagnosis. And this is a phase 3 clinical trial. So what phase 3 clinical trials do is they compare new treatments with the best available current treatments. So moving on from that, at the time of relapse, we have large phase 2 clinical trials such as Beacon-2 open in the UK and soon to open more broadly across Europe. And what these larger phase 2 trials ask is, does this trial work well enough to be tested in a larger phase 3 clinical trial? And then after that is an early phase clinical trial, and this is more where MINT would fit in. And in an early phase clinical trial, trials such as MINT will ask, first of all, what is the safe dose of a new drug when it's given alone or in combination? But also in children, we would never just run an early phase trial to ask about the safe dose of a drug. We would want to find out, is this combination or is this drug effective? Does this look promising to progress through the higher phases of study? So that just gives a bit of a broad overview about how early phase trials work really within the context of neuroblastoma. So I'm going to start by talking about how MIBG therapy and talazoparib work. So excuse my artwork, it's not very good, but these round circles are meant to represent neuroblastoma cells. And on the surface of neuroblastoma cells, there are many things that we can have to identify them as neuroblastoma cells. And one of these things is something called a net transporter. And these are meant to be represented by these little tubes here. And net transporters sit on the surface of neuroblastoma cells. And when they're recognized by the correct molecules, they're taken up into the neuroblastoma cells. So MIBG is a molecule that is taken up by net transporters to inside neuroblastoma cells. Now, when we link MIBG with something called 1,2,3-iodine, this gives a very small dose of irradiation, but that dose of irradiation can be used to light up where neuroblastoma cells in the body. This is an MIBG scan, which I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with. So the difference between an MIBG scan and MIBG therapy is that we link the MIBG to something called 131 iodine, and this gives a bigger dose of irradiation. So instead of just using a small dose to light up the images on a scan, this is a larger dose of irradiation with the aim of killing the cells, in this case, the neuroblastoma cells that the dose of radiotherapy is delivered to. So it's a form of targeted radiotherapy specifically for neuroblastoma cells. So how does MIBG therapy work together with talazoparib? So that what the radiotherapy does is it causes damage to the DNA within neuroblastoma cells. Now, normally, when you damage DNA, there's a protein called PARP, and that helps to repair the DNA. Talazoparib is known as a PARP inhibitor, so it stops PARP doing its job. It stops PARP repairing the DNA. And then because the DNA cannot be repaired, then the neuroblastoma cell dies. So that's really describing the concept behind combining MIBG therapy and talazoparib. I'm going to talk in a bit more detail now about the science behind that and why we think certain groups of patients may benefit from the MINT study. Before I talk about the types of patients that may benefit from the MINT study, I just need to talk a little bit about some of the science behind gene mutations and cancer. So on this picture here, you can see a picture of DNA, and it's made of a series of genes. And essentially, genes make proteins, and proteins do all of the job in a cell. So if, for example, you're a liver cell, you'll need to make proteins to do the jobs that a liver cell does, and you'll make different proteins compared to if you're a nerve cell. So that's just basically sort of how all the cells in our body work. What happens in cancer is you get a mutation in a gene, so you get a change in the sequence from what it should be. And this can do two things. It can make an abnormal protein that works too much, or an abnormal protein that doesn't work properly, or no protein at all because of this change in sequence. And it's these mutations in genes that cause problems in proteins that usually give the cancer cell some sort of survival advantage, help the cell continue to survive and grow. And sometimes cancer cells have mutations in genes known as DNA damage repair genes. This means they're not as good at repairing DNA if it's broken compared with healthy cells. We think that neuroblastomas with mutations in DNA damage repair genes may be particularly sensitive to MINT. So we see different groups of mutations in children with neuroblastoma. So this is in children with high-risk neuroblastoma, about a quarter of children, we find MYC-N amplification. This tends to be younger children and is associated with quite fast-growing disease. There's a group of patients with mutations in the gene called ATRX, and this occurs in about 10% of patients with high-risk neuroblastoma at the time of diagnosis. And the interesting thing about ATRX mutations is they're never found with MYC-N amplification. They're a completely separate group of patients. These patients tend to be a bit older, usually at least aged 5 years and above, and they have a sort of slower growing disease. So the neuroblastoma behaves quite differently in patients with MYC-N amplified neuroblastoma versus patients with ATRX alterations. And then the other gene that people have commonly heard about in neuroblastoma is ALK. And this isn't a separate group of patients. This is actually a gene mutation that can occur with MYC-N amplification. It can occur with ATRX alterations, or it can occur on its own. So that just gives a summary about the common types of gene mutations that we see in neuroblastoma. And one of the things that my lab is interested in is this group of patients with ATRX gene mutations and trying to find new therapies for this group of patients. So what evidence do we have? So the picture on this slide is really a result from some experiments that we did in mouse models of neuroblastoma. And we did these experiments because we screened over 400 drugs in cell line models of neuroblastoma to try to find new therapies that might be effective for ATRX mutant cells. And one of the strongest hits that came up in that drug screen were PARP inhibitors. So on this side here, olaparib is a PARP inhibitor that is very, very similar to talazoparib, that is the drug that is being tested in this trial. And here, these bar charts are known as waterfall plots. Everything above the x-axis here is essentially tumor progression in a mouse. And everything below here is regression. So down to 100% would be a complete regression of the tumor. And when we tested a combination of a PARP inhibitor with a drug that damages DNA, in this case, irinotecan, you can see that in the mouse model that did not have any type of ATRX mutations, this grew through both of the single agent combinations in red and dark blue here, and the combination of therapies in pale blue. However, in two different models with two different types of ATRX mutations that we commonly see in patients with neuroblastoma, what we found was that when we combine a PARP inhibitor with a drug that damages DNA, we saw this really nice responses in our mouse models. And this was really the first idea that we should be looking at combining PARP inhibitors with DNA damaging agents, potentially in clinical trials for children with neuroblastoma. PARP inhibitors have already been in clinical trials with neuroblastoma. They've been combined with irinotecan in clinical trial for all children with relapsed or refractory solid tumours. And they've also been combined with other drugs. This is this example here in the red box is in fact a patient who had a PARP inhibitor combined with a different drug and had a response reported in a clinical trial. So we're starting to see some early evidence that this might be an effective combination to move forwards. At the top of this slide here is just another case example. This is from a group in the US from Sarah Federico. And they tested combining a PARP inhibitor actually with irinotecan and with radiotherapy in a patient that had a BARD1 mutation. This is a different type of gene mutation to ATRX, but it's also predicted to result in problems with how DNA damage is repaired. And this patient had a really good response to PARP inhibitor-based combination therapy. So this small sort of single patient case reports being published in the literature now, showing that this seems to be quite effective in certain groups of children. At the bottom of the slide is just another paper. This is again in the lab, not in patients. But it also shows that when you give PARP inhibitors in combination with radiotherapy, it broadly makes the radiotherapy more effective. So broadly, regardless of the type of mutation that you have in the neuroblastoma cell, it seems to make the radiotherapy work better, just based on what we know about how these drugs work together. So as well as thinking that there might be some very specific groups of children who may benefit from this treatment, it also seems that it might be helpful more broadly for children with neuroblastoma. So hopefully I've convinced you that there's enough data to support a clinical trial to look in more depth at PARP inhibitors, specifically for children with neuroblastoma. And we know that PARP inhibitors are unlikely to be effective as single agents. They need combining with something to damage the DNA in the first place. And there have been some clinical trials of PARP inhibitors, mainly in combination with irinotecan and or irinotecan temozolomide in neuroblastoma and other solid tumours that occur in children. And although we've seen some early evidence that this looks like it may work in some children, it can be quite toxic combining PARP inhibitors with chemotherapy. And the main side effect of combining both of these agents is the fact that it suppresses your bone marrow cells, so it makes you anemic, it suppresses your white blood cells, neutrophils. And that's one of the problems in these trials so far. And that's really where the idea came up to combine PARP inhibitors with MIBG therapy. Because although it does have similar toxicities, we actually routinely give stem cell rescue to patients following MIBG therapy. So these are stem cells stored in the freezer that we give to help recover after a dose of MIBG therapy. And that sort of negates the main toxic side effects of this combination. And on that basis, we think this is something that our children are likely to benefit from this combination. So I'm going to finish off by talking a little bit more about the design of the MINT study. So as I said at the beginning, MINT is an early phase trial for patients with neuroblastoma that's relapsed or not responded to other treatments. And within the UK clinical trial landscape, we would imagine that this would fit in very much for children who have received Beacon-style treatment or some sort of treatment for first relapse. And they may need another option after that Beacon therapy to maybe further consolidate response, or maybe things have stabilized, but we need something else. And that's really where we see MINT fitting in at this stage as an early phase clinical trial. The study design is very simple. We will enroll two groups of patients called Group A and Group B. Group A are patients that have a mutation in one of these DNA damage genes that I've talked about. And of those, we predict that the most common will be ATRX and then followed probably by BARD1. Although, as you can see, there's a big long list of gene names on this slide. These are really, really rare in neuroblastoma, but they are occasionally seen. And if a patient happens to have a mutation in one of these genes, we would put them in Group A of this trial. Group B is really all comers. It's for children that do not have a mutation in one of these genes. So a patient with McN amplified neuroblastoma would be eligible for Group B of this study. And the only main reason, the treatment is exactly the same, whatever group you're in. The only reason that we're separating the groups is because if we open a clinical trial for everyone, there's a risk that we won't get enough patients that we're particularly interested in to answer that question about whether these patients with these DNA damage repair gene mutations are particularly sensitive. So it just ring fences a certain number of slots so that we can answer that question specifically and not run the risk of recruiting 42 patients to a clinical trial and due to statistical chance not even having 1 or 2 patients with an ATRX mutation, for example. So as I've said, the treatment is completely the same between groups. There will be 21 patients enrolled per group. And the schedule is very simple. We give talazoparib, the PARP inhibitor, first of all for 6 days, just to check that it's tolerated quite well. And then we will escalate the length of the schedule to 14 days. And MIBG therapy is given on day 3. So MIBG therapy is given as a single infusion. There are some things to be aware of when giving MIBG therapy in that during the few days after it's delivered, we have to sort of limit contacts. And although parents can be next door in a room and see patients, they can't be sort of cuddling patients and very close to them. So there are some limitations with MIBG therapy that I'm happy to talk about in more detail. But generally, it's a treatment that is very well tolerated, and we would expect this combination to be very well tolerated. And as I've said, we give stem cell rescue routinely in this protocol. That's given on day 17 of treatment. So MINT is an international clinical trial. It's led from the UK, but it's really been developed in close collaboration, particularly with my colleagues in Toronto, with Daniel Morgenstern and Sarah Cohen-Gogo in particular. And the plan is that we will open in the 3 sites in the UK that can deliver MIBG, which is the Royal Marsden Hospital, UCLH in Glasgow. And then we will also open in Sick Kids in Toronto, Princess Maxima Centre in Utrecht, and Charity in Berlin. And the reason why international collaboration is so important for a trial such as this is that, as we've already said, mutations in genes such as ATRX are rare. And we want to make this trial as accessible as possible, but we also want to increase our chances of recruiting patients with gene mutations that we're particularly interested in, so that we can truly test our hypothesis. So the take-home messages really are that MINT is a clinical trial that will open later this year at 3 sites. It combines MIBG. This is a standard of care treatment that we have been given at the time of relapse or refractory disease for decades. So MIBG is by no means a new treatment, but it combines it with a new agent, a PARP inhibitor known as talazoparib. Based on our data so far, we think that adding talazoparib will make MIBG more effective. And although it is only open in 3 centres in the UK, just to say that patients can, of course, be referred through our established networks to these centres for treatment. So I think I will stop there and stop sharing. And then I believe we move on before there's any questions.
Well, Dr. George, thank you so much for an extremely informative and clear presentation. And thank you for everything that you're doing for these kids. It is amazing and greatly appreciated. So it's my pleasure now to hand over the mic to Helen, who is going to talk about her family's neuroblastoma journey and discuss the need for more treatment options for children with high-risk subgroups. Helen?
Thank you, Gavin. I'm happy to be invited back to present again as a parent advisor with the Solving Kids Cancer webinar. I'm just going to talk a little bit about our family's journey. My son is an ATRX, has the ATRX mutation. So our journey was kind of long. If you want to go to the next slide, can kind of introduce you to my son. He was diagnosed in 2011 with high-risk neuroblastoma and the ATRX mutation. He relapsed 3 times over about 9 years. So you can see in the photos on the far left, that was around transplant time. And then on the far right, that photo is more recent. That's from last year, actually. And so we off and on battled for about 9 years of treatment. And during that time, we are US based. So during that time, we're at 2 other neuroblastoma centers looking, as you always are, for kind of new treatment options. So going to the next slide, little bit of an eye chart, but I tried to map out a little bit of kind of what our journey looked like. And you can see in red kind of where the relapses happened. So I think this is pretty, most of the other neuroblastoma or ATRX kids that I know have relapses. So this might look familiar to other families who are looking and see this similar to their journey. So our first relapse was actually progression. It was right after the resection. A tumor grew back right before we were going to go into transplant. So that was pretty scary. We did make the decision with our home oncologist. We are based in Minnesota. We did decide to resect that tumor and then just to continue through transplant and just try to stay in front line. And that went well. The resection got him back to NED, and we made it through. As you can imagine, we were very nervous during that time, having a progression so early on. But as we made our way through those cycles, we started to worry a bit about stopping treatment. And at that time, there were not a lot of maintenance trials. I started going to parent conferences around that time, got connected with Solving Kids Cancer, with Donna specifically, and went to the CNCF conference, which is held in Chicago every summer, and started to hear about Dr. Scholler, who had DFMO trials starting around that time. Matthew was the 7th patient on that new trial, and he was the first relapse patient. So we traveled to Michigan, which is about 8 hours from Minnesota. Or the U.S. is a big country. Even going over a couple states is quite a long journey. So we were then working with Dr. Scholler. She then got to know our home oncologist, and they opened the trial in Minneapolis. So the second year of the trial, we were able to be at our home hospital. That worked well until about a year after finishing DFMO, had another relapse. Luckily for us, this was around the time that dinutuximab and irinotecan temozolomide combination had just been really proven out. And Matthew was the first patient in our state to take advantage of that chemotherapy. It was very effective. Then the question became, because it was so new, how many cycles do we do? I recall going back to the CNCF conference again and asking all of the providers, how many cycles should we do? There wasn't an answer, of course, but we ended up doing 15 cycles. And again, we're worried about stopping. So then looked into the Memorial Sloan Kettering vaccine, met Dr. Modak again at a CNCF conference, and started traveling then to New York to take advantage of that vaccine trial. Made it through that trial. At that time, that trial was 7 doses. And 3 months after finishing that trial, he relapsed again, this time with a focal relapse, which is just one spot. We went back to our dinutuximab and IT chemo again to get back into NED. We did some proton radiation to the spot. And then we decided that we wanted to try naxitamab. Obviously, is a different kind of GD2 antibody, so we decided to do some cycles of that. And then we were able to try the vaccine again. Dr. Modak, who leads that vaccine, started to play around with some ideas of maybe kids just needed more doses. So Matthew was in a small cohort of patients that were able to take it a second time. He got through that one and his last treatment, which is in July 2020. And so he's been off treatment for 5 years. And that vaccine trial is now a longer trial based on that sort of unofficial study. So going to the next slide, just a few thoughts on lessons learned along the way. As we are all here today seeking information, getting a second opinion, I think, is always so important. Seeking out parent conferences, if you're in the UK or in the US, there's a lot of different options, places you can go to hear what the latest treatments are, how things are going with studies. One call out is Facebook. There is actually an ATRX specific Facebook group called Neuroblastoma ATRX support group. If you want to look into that, that is a quite small group, and you do have to be an ATRX, have a diagnosis of ATRX to join, but it can be helpful to find other parents to sort of talk through and see if there are some commonalities. On the advocating side, I think that is something that sometimes comes hard to parents early on. You're worried about misspeaking or not saying the terms correctly, but I would just say that's something that you just need to do and to kind of get over and be persistent and keep asking. And then on the right-hand side, they're just staying positive. As somebody who works a lot in math in my day career, I had to learn not to think too much about percentages, and just to really find the joy in each day. Finding another support network of parents is also very helpful. And then just sort of staying focused on where you are and what step you're on now, I think is always very helpful. One thing to call out with other parents is that I found it very useful to ask them some of the particulars of a trial, like how many days are you usually there? How can I expect my child to feel after treatment? How will they feel the next day? Just sort of getting some of those logistical questions that other parents can help you understand when you're trying to decide what the next step might be, whether you're going to participate in a trial. So I hope you think this is helpful. As we can finish up, and I think there's probably some QA questions. So I'd just like to say thank you to Solving Kids Cancer for putting on these seminars and for all they do to bring our community together. It's half the battle is trials being open, and the other part of the battle is parents being able to find out about them. So big thanks to them.
Well, Helen, a big thanks to you for sharing Matthew's story. Please give him a big hello from all of us. And I thought your words of wisdom were spot on. As a parent who has been through this, I think everything you said hit home for me. So thank you for sharing all of that. And yeah, we are going to move on to questions. And I'm going to ask Dr. George to rejoin us here on screen. And we will tick through the Q&A. And I think we've got about 9 or 10 questions. So I'm just going to take them in order and throw it open to our panel. And the first question is, are these gain of function or loss of function ATRX mutations?
So these are generally thought to be loss of function mutations. There's many different types of mutations, but broadly speaking, it means that the ATRX doesn't work properly.
All right, thank you very much. The next one here, do PARP inhibitors cause toxicity? What are the side effects, and what about long-term effects?
So yes, the main toxicity of PARP inhibitors is suppressing bone marrow. So a bit like chemotherapy, low immune cells, hemoglobin, low platelets. So may need transfusions, may have immune suppression. We only give PARP inhibitors for 2 weeks in this study. So in terms of long-term side effects, not at all. It's a very short duration of treatment. And the reason we give the stem cell return is because the side effects are expected and predictable and the same as MIBG therapy, but we routinely give the stem cells back to negate those side effects, although we would expect a period when your bone marrow was suppressed while you're waiting for the stem cells to kick back in.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. Next one here. Can children who have already had MIBG therapy with chemotherapy be on this study?
Yes. Is the short answer. There's a maximum dose of MIBG, so it's written in the protocol. There's a maximum lifetime dose of MIBG therapy allowed, but it is perfectly feasible. Say you've had one previous course of MIBG therapy to still be eligible for this study.
Yeah, and I think you touched on this next question in your presentation, but we'll just clarify. Will the trial be open to patients from outside of the UK? And I recall Toronto and France, but anything else you want to add to that?
Yes. So actually, interestingly, so we'll open Toronto, Netherlands, Charity, UK. Charity is Berlin. We really wanted to open this as a transatlantic trial to also open in the USA. And we weren't able to do that actually for lots of reasons, but one was some uncertainty about MIBG supply. And that's been a problem. I saw one of the questions had popped up in the chat about that. So that made it not practical at this time because of the way that the American supply chain was set up, although I think that's something that's resolving. But they're the countries that we're going to open at the moment. We're open to we're very much open to open as widely as we can, but we'll start with those 4 countries and see where we get on.
Well, hopefully at some point we can get this study here in the U.S. and have the MIBG issues, if there are still any remaining, resolved. It's heartbreaking when we see these supply issues impacting availability of care and studies for these kids who desperately need new treatment options. The next one is one I was going to ask, so I'm glad someone else did. If my child has an ATRX mutation and is also ALK positive, could he receive lorlatinib whilst being on the MINT study?
So the short answer is no, not for the duration of the MINT study. And that's because we haven't tested that combination. We're not sure how safe it is to give it all together. So that wouldn't be possible within the MINT study, I'm afraid.
Okay. And then I didn't notice ALK on the list of genes that you had on the one slide. Did I just miss that, or is there a reason it wasn't there?
No, it was at the bottom. So the thing about MICN and ATRX is they're completely different. They never go together. And then I think I did put ALK at the bottom because it sort of goes across all subgroups. You can have an ALK mutation with MICN, you can have an ALK mutation with ATRX, or you can have it on your own.
No, I was referring to the slide where you had the group A and group B. Yeah. And you listed out the genes, BRCA1, BRCA2, and the others. I didn't see ALK there, but
No, it's not one of these DNA damage repair genes that we think will be particularly sensitive. So if you had an ALK mutation, you'd be eligible for the all-comers group.
Got it.
But it's not one of the specific genes of interest for this study.
All right. Thank you for the clarification. All right. Let me see if I can get back to my place here. Here we go. The next one is, we spend a lot of time in 2025 trying to get MIBG treatment for our daughter, but there was a shortage of MIBG for treatment. Do you know what the status is on the supply, and when do you expect it to open?
So the supply has been a huge issue and something we've been very aware of while we've been designing this trial. There are 2 companies currently that supply MIBG to the UK and Europe, and we have given some MIBG therapy from those companies in recent months. It's got a little bit better recently. It hasn't been great over the last year, so I'm really sorry to hear if you have struggled. The minivan trial was MIBG based as well, and it may be a trial that people on the call are aware of, and we're really hoping to sort of build on that. With careful planning, we were able to deliver MIBG, at least in the UK. And so we're really hoping to build on that infrastructure from Minivan, and the people involved in Minivan are helping us to make sure that we can, with careful planning, we might not be able to get it on the exact day we want to, but with careful planning that we can find a way to move forwards as they did in Minivan. So that's the plan at the moment.
Got it. Thank you. All right, I'm going to read this next one. Hopefully this one makes sense to you. Will children have cleared MIBG by D+14 to have stem cell return?
So I think is it in terms of clearing the radiation, probably.
I would think. Yeah.
So yes, I mean, the protocol we're using, actually, this is a UK-led trial using an American protocol. So this is the same design in terms of timing, dose of MIBG and timing of stem cell return that was given in the NANT 1101 trial. And so yes, there's lots of experience with regards to timings of stem cell return.
All right. Thank you. These are great questions. Keep them coming. And I'm going to go to the next one here. See, hold on one sec. Thank you so much for sharing your story. This gives so much hope. What was the financial burden of participating in so many trials, traveling, etc.? That one obviously is for Helen.
Yes, that's the challenging part is sometimes when there aren't a lot of trials and they're not close by or they're not open at a center, that can be very challenging. For us, we were lucky enough to be able to go down to one income for that period of time. Again, it was sort of a long journey and it was off and on, so there was a lot of creative thinking. But yes, there is a financial burden. I mean, I would guess the say that the good side is, at least in the US. There are a lot of foundations that offer free flights. And then there's the Ronald McDonald House, other foundations that do give some kind of support. So definitely check with social workers on see what you can find that's available. But yeah, I won't sugarcoat it. It's hard, especially when it's over a long period of time.
Yeah, I would echo that. It's can be very challenging, but there are resources out there, and I think your advice, Helen, is spot on. The social worker team should have that information, or perhaps Solving Kids Cancer and other resources can direct you in the right place. Okay, next one. If patients are being referred to a center that is not near their home, what support is available financially and practically to allow these patients to access the trial? Again, I think that's a conversation with your provider. Dr. George, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yes, so everything Helen said is very true, that there is foundations and money available to support transport if it's required. I know that Solving Kids Cancer are working really hard to see how they can help with that at the moment. So it's something we're very aware of, and we absolutely wouldn't want not being able to afford to travel to be prohibitive to enter the study. So it's something that we're really actively working on at the moment.
All right. Let's see here. A couple of other questions about financial support. Big thank you to Helen for sharing your story. Here's a good question. Would this work with a FGFR1 mutation? I did not see it on your list.
So FGFR1 mutations are very, very rare, less than 1% of patients with neuroblastoma. So I just mentioned so no, this is not, FGF1R is not a DNA damage repair gene of interest for this study. Patients would be eligible for the all-comers arm, but not the enriched DNA damage repair arm.
Yeah. Next question is for Helen. Helen, do you think a maintenance option, DFMO/vaccine, played a significant role in your son's continued remission?
Well, it's hard to know, of course, because you don't know what would have happened if you didn't. But we felt strongly about it, wanting to try to keep in remission. So that's why we kind of sought out both of those avenues. And vaccine was the one that we ended up kind of leaning on the second time.
Yeah.
And I'm glad we did. That, as I say, there's no way of knowing, but it seems to have worked, at least in our study of one.
Very good. Next question. But if an American wanted to travel to Canada, would we be able to? Dr. George, I'm going to suggest perhaps that's a question for Daniel Morgenstern, but I don't know if you have thoughts there.
It's a question for Daniel.
Very good.
I don't know, I'm afraid.
Yeah. You're an expert in many things, but cross-border traveling in North America is probably not one of them.
Not so much.
All right, next question. I just want to say she had a Beacon trial, Kojak MIBG scan, but she relapsed, unfortunately, and she passed away. I'm not sure if that's a question, but it's certainly a sad and difficult comment. So our condolences. Next one, about MIBG, how long in advance do you need to order this in the EU?
We're about, at the moment, we need about a 2-week lead time. I think it's probably important to mention that, Helen gave a really lovely talk about her son's disease, and it was quite slow. It's sort of, Helen, like he read the textbook, so to speak, that this is quite slow disease, and that gives you a certain amount of planning time. So, we need about a 2-week lead time. This isn't a treatment. If there was very fast relapse, we'd want to give something more like chemotherapy to get control of the disease before considering an option like this. So, with careful planning, we can make it work, but we need a couple of weeks usually lead time to get access to the MIBG.
Got it. Thank you. I'm going to give a last call for questions here if folks want to chime in, because I think we're almost to the end. I do want to we got a note from our friends at SKC, and so I'm encouraged now to mention Joseph's Fund, which is, I believe, available towards travel costs in the United Kingdom. And I think it's a fund at the level of £50,000, which is very generous. So if you have questions about that, you can reach out to the team at SKC. And then the last question I see is not necessarily a question, but in the spirit of commenting or making sure that I'm addressing everything that's submitted, I'm going to read this. My daughter was treated by Royal Marsden, and she didn't respond to treatment. And actually, no, there's one more. How many courses can a patient have, Dr. George?
Up to 2 courses. So if you've responded to the first cycle, there is an option for a second.
Got it. Great. I think, nope, here we go. Got another one here. This is great. When do you expect the trial to open?
I don't want to be too certain because it's forever a moving timeline, but I'm hoping within the next few months.
Very good. And one final one here that I think is a perfect way to end. This is a thank you to Dr. George. Thank you, Dr. George. It is so inspiring to know that there are people working so hard for solutions. Amen to that. All right, I'm going to close us out here on that note, and thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you for your brilliant questions and your attention. I want to again thank Dr. George and Helen for their brilliant talks, and of course want to thank United Therapeutics, Norgine, Recordati Rare Diseases, and Y-Mabs Therapeutics for supporting this webinar series. I have a reminder here that this session has been recorded, so you'll be able to watch it back at any time. And we do hope that you'll be able to join us next Thursday for the 5th webinar in our 6-part series entitled CAR T-Cell Therapy, Bambino Gesù Trial, and Broadening Treatment in Europe, with speakers Dr. Francesca Del Buffalo and parent advocate Yana Tereshkova. So with that, thank you all again very much, and have a great rest of your day.